So the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that my talk is only different by a couple words from Will's keynote this morning. And I'm happy to report that despite the fact that I didn't corrupt his thinking by actually sending him the paper ahead of time, they're actually quite complementary, I think. I think they intersect well, so hopefully they won't come across as too redundant, but...
My sources at NSA had sent me an advanced copy.
Okay, good, I'm glad. So I want to talk about bridging the gap and kind of continue this conversation about how scholars can have an influence on policy. So in 1993, almost a quarter century ago, Alex George produced this path-breaking book that set out to encourage better communication and closer collaboration between academic scholars who study foreign policy specifically and practitioners who conduct it. Bridging the Gap was the name of the book. That's why this term has come into such de rigueur. Bridging the Gap, Theory and Practice in Foreign Policy was both a study and a model of the kind of two-way engagement that, that George was advocating. And even after a quarter century, this book is still the kind of touchstone for a lot of us who seek to understand and even facilitate the nexus of theory and policymaking. George saw two real problems as creating this gap, and it was really, the problem was on both sides. On the practitioner side, practitioners had an underdeveloped understanding of concepts and history, leading to both poor decision-making, but also poor identification and evaluation of strategic options in policymaking. It wasn't just that when they had the options, they made the wrong choice. It was that they couldn't see the options available to them because they didn't understand the concepts and the history and the theory. On the other side, scholars were failing to give enough attention to research questions that would be actually helpful for improving policy. And were ill-equipped to translate this research, kind of the stuff that Steve was just talking about, for policy audiences. And so George set out in his kind of project to understand why this gap was there and really push for ways to get the knowledge base, the conceptual, theoretical base from academia into scholarship. One thing he wasn't trying to do, which he separated this field, these types of knowledge out from, was the need for reliable and timely intelligence about situational developments. He saw that as kind of the bailiwick of a different category of people, not university-based scholars, but maybe journalists, diplomats, the intelligence community. And I'm going to actually try to close that gap a little bit and suggest that scholars need to meet policymakers where they work and where they live. And that is, especially in national security and especially in foreign policy in the United States, that is in situational development, right? That's where their focus is. And so trying to find ways to get them to listen to theory and read theory is going to be futile if what they're subject to is the tyranny of the inbox. And that is kind of something you hear increasingly from policymakers. And so I think we as scholars, and I think Will's right, that you hear a lot of this more from the scholarly side than the practitioner side. What we need to do to try to find ways to bridge this gap is find ways to filter that knowledge and research that comes from our academic training into usually the people who will then provide the situational knowledge that policymakers are using. So I want to talk about some of the ways that has developed and the ways that can be done. So the story I'll tell is one of really kind of significant progress in bridging the gap between university-based academics and elements in the US intelligence community. I agree with Will that this is an area that's better than many for policy engagement. Before I try to justify that claim, I'll first make my case for why bridging the gap in general is so important and also so difficult. I'll review a little bit of the history of why I think it fits well with the intelligence analysis mission, and then provide some recent examples of outreach and collaboration between these groups. Finally, I'll talk about some of the ongoing challenges to bridging the gap with intelligence, namely the role of secrecy, the devolved nature of the IC, limited influence of intelligence products themselves on policymaking, and then the role of intelligence studies and policy relevance both in the academy. So I'm a little evangelical about this because I'm part of an organization called the Bridging the Gap Project that Steve mentioned. For about 13 years, we've been running workshops initially for PhD students, but now also for professors, to try to build and develop both policy relevant research agendas and also to train scholars in translation. So we do media training, we bring in editors from journals and blogs and op-ed pages and people who've kind of gone back and forth into the policy world to talk about how to do this. And so I'm very firmly an advocate of doing this, and I'll talk about why. I think there are three reasons that scholars should try to bridge the gap, should try to get their work to be more policy relevant. First is it improves your research, right? scholars who study foreign policy, for those scholars, exposures to practitioners can provide valuable access to data, such as documents, potential interview subjects, but also some of the kind of soaking and poking data just for understanding organizational structures and cultures, information on bureaucratic and partisan political influences, like how do you understand how those different factors are weighed in decision making. The more you're engaging with the policy community, the better you understand those things. It's not just true in foreign policy, but I think it is especially true in foreign policy. So that's the first reason. The second reason is to improve policy, right? This is what George was really focused on. He was trying to understand why US policy and how US policy really wasn't fleshed out well in the first Iraq War. So that was his kind of case study in the book. But he was really thinking about all this kind of base of knowledge and why it was so different from what we saw policymakers doing. So many academics entered their studies. Many of us decided to do PhDs, not just because we wanted to understand the world better, but because we thought we might be able to make it a better place, right? To actually have some influence in the world. As many of us will have found, we tend to have this kind of desire to make the world a better place drummed out of us in PhD programs through circular debates about methodology and epistemology, advisors encouraging us to kind of push that body of knowledge just marginally at the edges out when it's already pretty well overdeveloped, but something that can get published using modern methods that nobody understands outside of your discipline. Right, so the incentives within the academy are not to maintain that desire to make the world a better place through your scholarship. And so in part, policy relevance is about kind of finding that inner child again, right? Finding that, remembering why we got involved in trying to influence policy or national security or why we want to understand a certain historical period in the first place. The Harvard historian Ernest May also saw a role for scholars really alongside journalists in serving as truth tellers about the benefits and challenges of specifically intelligence work, but of policy work more generally. May saw that insiders in government are unlikely to be good accountants or good auditors for the way policies are happening. There's checks and balances and there's some oversight, but scholars can have a role in basically auditing the policy process and trying to make it better through that process as well. The third reason is to contribute to society more generally, right? So there's the trying to fix a policy, like make policy decisions better. But I think there's also a role for public scholarship. And in 2002, Robert Putnam used his American Political Science Association presidential address to make a case for what he called the public role of political science. He described, quote, contributions to public understanding and to the vitality of democracy as core professional responsibilities of the discipline. And I know we're not all political scientists here, but I believe the same logic holds across academic disciplines. I personally believe in public service. I know there are a lot of people who work in public service, in law enforcement and national security. And I believe that scholars have a duty to produce knowledge for the public good, if that's what you do, if your knowledge can serve in that way. I agree also with Will that knowledge for knowledge's sake is an admirable enterprise, whether it's through pure science or figuring out pushing that knowledge just a little bit marginally at the edges. That's still a noble enterprise, but I think if you can affect the way that society operates through your research, that's normatively better, I believe. So those are some of the reasons why I think scholars should try to bridge the gap. So why is it so difficult? And we've heard about this already some, and I've described my efforts at the Bridging the Gap project with my colleagues there. I'll talk about 3 challenges drawn from that experience through Bridging the Gap and also from the literature. And before I do, I'll just point, Steve Marion has a really good piece in INS that talks about this specifically for intelligence studies as well. And so there's a kind of burgeoning literature on this that's worth looking into. So even though I'm not a psychologist, I tried to put together a fancy slide to demonstrate my first point, which is that there's a real chicken and egg problem with generating policy relevant research, right? How do you know what's going to be policy relevant by the time you get the research done? Policymakers don't need a good idea for research, backed up by an elegant research design that will eventually fledge into a useful finding. Policymakers need the whole chicken now. And it's not just any chicken. They need the right chicken, a pretty nicely packaged, well-trained chicken that does just what they want it to do, right? That serves them in the questions that they're asking right then. But as scholars know, you can't just turn an egg into a chicken. You can't just turn an idea immediately into a policy relevant piece of research. It takes time. So there's this challenge of developing tractable, theoretically interesting and relevant, but also policy relevant research that will provide timely findings for policymakers. And this is not something that we're trained to do in graduate programs. Now, one thing we've done at Bridging the Gap is to use a scenario analysis in our graduate student workshop and at some workshops we've done with policymakers in other countries especially, to try to identify questions that are going to be useful for policymakers in the kind of 5 to 7 year time horizon. So you identify the questions now so you can start the research and then have it paying dividends by the time that you believe policymakers will need it, in the research stream. So that's the first reason. It's hard to come up with the right questions. The second, policymakers don't read well and academics don't write well for each other, right? And this is something that Steve and Will both also spoke to. It's not due to intellectual deficiencies on either side. The two groups just look for different things. Practitioners have very little time to read. That's one thing we hear consistently from every practitioner we bring into our workshops. And need information that will help them make decisions now. Scholars value nuance, methodological rigor, which tends to lead to narrow and contingent findings, often presented in long-form, jargon-riddled prose that's really indecipherable to readers outside the discipline, even other academics, right? Often, and understandably, and this is the pushback we get from scholars sometimes, is that scholars don't want to strip away all of this nuance and rigor in ways they feel will undermine the integrity of the research, right? They don't want to distill their research because they've spent so much methodological thinking on it, right? Moreover, there's a second reason that scholars aren't particularly well positioned to do this is because other people are. Think tanks, FFRDCs have become increasingly adept at filling this space, right? Translating research for policymaking. And so policymakers in Washington especially have access to a local, attentive community that's trained to understand both research and the policy process. So the comparative advantage for scholars isn't necessarily there. So that's the second piece. The third piece is that academic incentive structures really devalue policy relevance and outreach. I've talked about that a little bit in training before, or about the training process before. But this is true across the board. In training, we don't teach translation skills. And practitioners report, for example, through the TRIP surveys or in the great piece by Paul Avey and Mike Desch that Steve referred to, that policymakers want deep area studies knowledge. That's what's helpful to them, right? They want the language skills, they want the historical knowledge, the contextual knowledge, and that is not the direction that social science is going in publication and tenure and hiring decisions. And so there's a kind of disjuncture there as well. So it's true at the training level. It's true in job seeking, right? Advisors often they want to train people to extend research through R1 academic universities, sometimes exclusively. It's also hard to move from policy into academia. So if you're on the job market as a PhD student or a postdoc or something, and you have an option between a policy job and maybe an academic job that you're not as excited about, you know that if you take the policy job, the academic road might be cut off for you in the future. So there's kind of a one-way street there that's hard to break down. And also in tenure decisions, right? Policy impact is hard to weigh. It sometimes even counts against scholars. And that's actually a second part of our initiative in Bridging the Gap we just started is to we've convened a couple meetings of provosts from universities around the country to talk about the incentive structures within the university for tenure promotion and for hiring and how you might build into that policy relevance, right? In the UK, they've started to weigh impact as an important factor for university divisions and colleges. And so that's the kind of thing that we want to keep working with provosts to think about moving forward. So thankfully, we're starting to see some movement in the last of these. One kind of data point on this, and when we first started our initiative with grad students in 2005, we had students who were coming from top 5 political science programs who felt they couldn't tell their advisors they were coming to a workshop, fully paid in Berkeley. It was nice, right? They couldn't tell their advisors that they were thinking about wanting to do policy relevant research because they knew that might endanger their resources, the attention they were getting from their advisors who wanted them to be more ivory tower scholars, right? We don't really see that anymore. I think that the norms within the discipline have changed enough that we don't see that as much anymore. So with that general frame for Bridging the Gap in mind, let's think about the state of affairs in intelligence. And I'll cut this back a little bit because I know I'm short on time. But I want to refer back to the history that was brought up in the Q&A with Will this morning. It's telling and important that the early history of U.S. intelligence is written in books with titles like Robin Wink's Cloak and Gown, Ray Klein's Secrets, Spies and Scholars, right? The RNA division of OSS was founded by scholars. The McGeorge Bundy, actually, Wild Bill Donovan actually called RNA the professors. He referred to them as professors. McGeorge Bundy would later reflect that it's a curious fact of academic history that the first great center of area studies in the United States was not located at any university, but in Washington during the Second World War in the Office of Strategic Services. So area studies departments around the country were populated by people who were coming out of OSS. So there's a real deep history of connection between the community and scholars. Winks reports that by 48, 49, just a year or two into the CIA personnel represented 77 different colleges and universities. So there was a kind of broad, not just Yale, right? So there was a broad attention there. This persistence of academic representation wasn't always popular. I've got another fancy slide. Nixon once asked Haldeman and Caspar Weinberger, his OMB chief, to make sure that they stopped recruiting for CIA from the Ivy Leagues in Stanford and Berkeley. He saw CIA as a bunch of Georgetown liberals who were trying to undermine his policies. He wanted to be sure that any new recruits came from schools that agreed with their policies, specifically on Vietnam, but in general, right? So there's been a tradition of this academic basis for CIA and analysis, especially being held against them, right, by certain leaders. Stansfield Turner, who was DCI under Jimmy Carter, referred to the CIA Analytical Branch as being given to tweedy, pipe-smoking intellectuals who work much as if they were doing research back in the universities. He said their expertise ranges from anthropology to zoology, yet for all that, they can be wrong. Right? They're experts, but they may be too distant from the actual operational world of intelligence. And I know I think I'm over time already, but I'm going to keep going. You'll shut me up when I need to. Okay. I'll try to collapse this a little bit. So the academic orientation is hard baked into the intelligence analysis process. So in recent years, the IC has accelerated its efforts to bring in outside expertise. And I want to just kind of highlight three sorts of initiatives to this end. I'll call them scanning, soliciting, and sponsoring. And we've heard a little bit about them from other talks, but each of them appears in the Intelligence Community Directive 205 on analytical outreach. So in July 2008, D&I McConnell issued IC Directive 205 that really mandated outreach on the part of the IC components. And so you'll see these are kind of just three of the policy directives that are found inside the IC Directive 205. But it's really mandated, it's directing the elements to seek outside knowledge, not just from academics, from business, from others as well, but it's a real kind of shift in orientation for some of the agencies. So scanning first. Some elements in the IC, especially INR at the State Department, parts of CIA have been doing this for years, right? They go to talks, they go to conferences, they run brown bag series, they produce in-house academic research. The INR's Office of Research serves now as the hub for this research. The Directive 205 identifies INR as the kind of hub for this work, and they do about 170 outreach projects a year. As another example of scanning, the ISA Intelligence Studies section, thank you, Steve, is a truly kind of unusual beast among sections, right? You don't see many sections of ISA or any other academic discipline that bring policymakers, practitioners, scholars, people from the private sector together in a venue to talk about academic work and how it can help government work. So that's the kind of scanning the IC has done well, better than most. Second, soliciting. Both analytical and technical elements in the IC have developed these kind of ongoing collaboration efforts with scholars across disciplines. One example that's been mentioned is the IC Associates Program. 1997, the NIC, National Intelligence Council, established the precursors to that, and that's grown. It's about 200 associates, I think, now, and is a kind of ongoing resource that they can tap when they have specific questions or want to convene a meeting. NIC's Global Trends Initiative, which I know Will has been involved with as well, has also institutionalized academic input. And in fact, one of my Bridging the Gap project co-directors, Steve Weber, has been played a role in helping develop and refine the same kind of scenario tools that we use in Bridging the Gap for the Global Trends Initiative. The Political Instability Task Force, formerly the State Failure Task Force, has been going for about 20 years, trying to build data sets of conflicts that might lead to state failure. And so that started as as unclassified work in university settings, sponsored by the CIA's Director of Intelligence. And regularly, as we've heard, the IC solicits white papers through IARPA, National Academies, others, to do targeted research. Finally, sponsoring, IC has committed resources, and I'll close on this. I was going to talk about the problems of bridging too, but we'll finish with this. Has committed resources to shaping the ways that universities train future intelligence officers. Of course, we don't need to look far to witness the fruits of this effort, right? UTEP is one of 20 universities that have participated in the IC Centers for Academic Excellence program, which is administered through DIA. In fact, last month in Florida, I was impressed by this. DIA hosted a workshop titled Academia Day to try to share information about the ICCAE program. There are smaller but related efforts at NSA, the National Centers for Academic Excellence in Cyber Operations, that I think also includes UTEP, the Computer Science Department. The CIA launched the Signature School program at the University of New Mexico last November. So the IC has really tried to build resources to back up this directive and reach out to the academic community in many ways that I think will be important and helpful moving forward. So I will stop that, and in Q&A, if we can talk about some of the challenges. Thank you.